thank you very much, Sean, and to Molly and Tim and everyone from SENEDIA. Thank you very much for putting this together. Thank you for the invitation and for including me here. You've got some heavy hitters here today from Secretary Del Toro, Secretary Geary. Of course, we're going to hear from Admiral Hahn in just a bit. So I'm honored to be part of the filler in between these big-name leaders that you have here today, and also to be part of a congressional delegation from Rhode Island that understands the importance of supporting our nation's military, our veterans, and our defense sector. I know you'll be hearing from Senator Whitehouse and my colleague in the House, Congressman Amo, tomorrow, I believe. Senator Reid is, of course, a regular at these and has been for a long time, but he's unable to make it this year because he is doing a trip to visit some of our allies in the Pacific, Korea and Japan, among others, I believe. But I know he's here in spirit. So as I look around the room, I see a number of people who I know were here last year when I was as well. But do we have a show of hands for first-timers? All right. How about first-timers to Rhode Island? We got a few. Okay, not as many. Well, Rhode Island, of course, has always been a hub for innovation. We are the birthplace of religious freedom. We are the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in North America with Slater Mill, the first factory of sorts in the Americas built in Pawtucket. But in particular, we have a rich history when it comes to naval and oceans technology, dating all the way back to the Revolutionary War, which of course began in Rhode Island with the burning of the Gaspee a full 3 years before the Boston Tea Party, and don't let anybody forget that. You know, if you're a history nerd like I am, Rhode Island's role in the early months and weeks and years of our nation's military is really a special thing. You know, with Benjamin Church going all the way back to the King Philip's War, we are the birthplace of what is now the Army Rangers. My district, over on the other side of the bay, is the birthplace of the United States Navy. Back in the pre-Revolution times, Rhode Island had 5 capitals. It was Providence, Newport, Bristol, East Greenwich, and what is now South Kingstown. And the General Assembly, the legislature, would rotate across the state. And in September of 1775, while they were meeting in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, which is in my district, the General Assembly voted to establish the first Navy in the Americas. So Rhode Island had its own Navy in the run-up to the American Revolution for about a month. And then a month later, the Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, established the United States Navy. So the official birthday of the Navy, I think, is October 17th. But Rhode Island did it first in September, the month earlier, to get a head start on everybody else. And of course, when the Continental Navy was established, Essex Hopkins, a Rhode Islander, was the first admiral, the first leader of the Navy, led the United Colonies in the first naval victory in the Bahamas over the British, in an area which coincidentally is called Providence in the Bahamas. And that line of leadership and innovation continues all the way through our history. I could go on and on about Oliver Hazard Perry. In the United States Capitol, there are 2 paintings of Rhode Islanders. If you're ever in the Capitol, you have the opportunity to take a tour, feel free to call my office. We will take you around. There are 2 paintings of Rhode Islanders hanging in the Capitol. Not many states can say that. One of them is Nelson Aldrich, who was a senator in the Victorian era that invented sort of the modern Federal Reserve and central banking system in the United States. But the big one, of course, is Oliver Hazard Perry, from Newport, born in South Kingstown, actually, in my district. Spent some time here in Newport in District 1, and of course, in the War of 1812, made possible the continuation of the United States as it exists today with his victory at the Battle of Lake Erie. If anyone is not familiar with that history, I encourage you, go on Wikipedia later, or whatever your favorite source of historical information is, It's really neat stuff. It's really neat stuff. During the War of 1812, the United States and the British were locked in this struggle. It at first did not go very well for the new United States. The British came and they burned the Capitol and they burned the White House, and things were looking kind of tenuous. And, of course, the British controlled Canada, and there was this sense that they were going to sweep down through the Midwest and capture American territory. And back then, the Great Lakes were a major battlefield in this conflict. Because if you think about the area around the Great Lakes, right, Michigan, what today is Michigan and Illinois and Ohio and Pennsylvania, was very rural at the time. The way that people got around and conducted commerce on the Great Lakes was primarily on the lakes, not around them, on the lakes, not on the land. And so during the spring and summer of 1813, the Americans on the south and the British on the north started building navies from the ground up, like cutting down trees, building ships to fight it out on the Great Lakes. And Oliver Hazard Perry from Rhode Island was the commander of the American side. They literally built a navy in the span of about 6 months from scratch, launched it onto the Great Lakes at Erie, Pennsylvania, defeated the British, won. He famously rallied his soldiers by flying a flag that said, "Don't give up the ship." So if you see those hanging around, particularly in Newport, now you know what that means, don't give up the ship. That was Oliver Hazard Perry's rallying cry to his men to defeat the British. After they defeated the British in the Battle of Lake Erie, he famously wrote to General Harrison, the commanding general at the time of the United States Armed Forces, and everybody knows the one-sentence letter that he wrote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," the ultimate mic drop moment, right, in naval history. He did all of this at 32 years old, so think about what you were doing at 32 at the time. But I tell my wife, because my wife is from Western Pennsylvania, she grew up in Pittsburgh, and if Oliver Hazard Perry had not won that battle in Lake Erie, the British would have swept down across the Great Lakes, and, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, etc., would be part of Canada today. So my wife would be Canadian, which I have told her many times. She still doesn't think it's funny. But that is just another example, once again, of the incredible heritage, particularly the naval heritage, that we are proud of here in Rhode Island. But we're here today to talk about innovation. And we are honored, again, to have a heritage here in Rhode Island of innovation in this space as well. We are essentially the birthplace of torpedoes and torpedo ships for the United States military. The first torpedo test station was here right off of Newport. The first Navy torpedo boat, the USS Lightning, was launched out of Bristol. We were the first to deploy Quonset huts. We pioneered wargaming at the Naval War College, and the list goes on and on. Today, we are proud to host Newark and remain on the cutting edge of undersea technology. And we're not just researchers here in Rhode Island, we are builders. We are developing and building vessels and technology that is critical to our national security, including, of course, the Navy's submarine program, as well as undersea unmanned systems. Rhode Island is very much the heart of the New England defense cluster, including DoD civilians, defense contractors, and active duty military. There are more than 34,000 people in Rhode Island working in defense. That's about 7% of our employment for the entire state, creating good paying jobs for Rhode Islanders, powering our local economy, all in service of our nation's shared security. And that is incredibly important today because we are living in a world that has become increasingly dangerous. From China to Russia and across the developing world, many countries have backslid into authoritarianism and become more aggressive because dictators know that when their citizens see democracies flourish elsewhere in the world, they will naturally yearn for freedom themselves. And so, if you are a Vladimir Putin or President Xi or the leadership in Iran, and you look at the United States and you see democracy working, you know that that is a threat to your own authoritarian rule. And this is a disturbing time in many ways. I grew up in the 1990s, which was a time when democracy was on the march globally. The Soviet Union had fallen and Russia had democratized briefly. The Eastern Bloc, even China, was having local elections in thousands of municipalities in the 1990s and early 2000s. And there was this sense in the 90s and early 2000s that democracy was on this inevitable, natural march around the world. Unfortunately, particularly over the last decade, we have seen backsliding in many parts of the world. And this has manifested itself in many forms, but increasingly, autocratic nations have been conducting aggressive acts against democratic nations on the world's oceans and seas. A few months ago, a Russian Navy frigate and a nuclear submarine entered Cuban waters, meant to be a show of force as tensions rise between our nations over the war in Ukraine. Chinese vessels regularly harass and assault other nations' craft in international waters, including a deliberate collision with a Philippine Coast Guard ship not long ago. And against that backdrop, America's Navy, America's Coast Guard, and in particular our naval submarine fleet, are some of the most vital advantages that we have in the defense of our nation and democracies around the world. So let's start with the submarine program. I'm proud to support this program in Congress because I know that not only is it good for Rhode Island, but more importantly, our submarine program is the greatest advantage we have relative to our adversaries and potential adversaries around the world, particularly China, because our submarine program is difficult for our adversaries to detect. This has been true for a long time, by the way. There's a great book, I believe, by Richard Reeves about the Kennedy presidency. And during the transition from the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration, Kennedy went to the White House to meet with Eisenhower for the first time since the election. And there was a sense at the time among the American public that while people liked Ike, he was at that time the oldest person ever to be president. He had had at least one stroke that people knew about. And there was a sense toward the end of his 8 years in office that maybe he wasn't operating at all cylinders anymore. And so Kennedy goes into this meeting at the White House, and his experience with Eisenhower is very different. He finds him to be very sharp, very with it, and very serious. And Eisenhower, among other things, says to him, if the Soviets try anything, we have a submarine fleet in the Pacific. That is our advantage. Do not hesitate to push the button if you need to. And Kennedy walks out of the White House and goes to his team kind of like, whoa, what have I gotten myself into, right? But from the Cold War up until today, our submarine program is our greatest deterrent against whether it's the Soviet Union 60 years ago, China, or our other adversaries today. And so we have to continue to work together to support the 2-in-1 production target for Virginia's and Columbia's, and use our allies as a force multiplier by delivering on AUKUS. And as we've been scaling up together the submarine program, we have been reminded that a major mobilization of this nature requires spending not only on what happens inside the factories and plants, but also everything that happens outside of those walls to support the work. So that means housing. It means childcare for workers. It means supporting the suppliers to help them also recruit and retain the workforce that they need. It means road, bridge, and port infrastructure. Things like this are not nice to haves. They are absolutely essential to our national security, and they should be treated as such. So I've added an amendment to last year's NDAA to help address workforce shortages, including by developing a strategy to expand SkillBridge participation to suppliers to improve the recruitment of their workforce, particularly those smaller suppliers. We've been pushing really hard on housing for the workforce in the submarine industrial base here in Rhode Island and also elsewhere in the country. And we're going to continue to fight for more funding for career and technical education programs and for apprenticeships because there is more than one path to success in this country. Not everything requires a 4-year degree. And, of course, there are many in-demand, high-wage jobs in shipbuilding and in defense generally that don't require a 4-year degree but do require some specialized training. So continuing to lean in to career and technical education at the high schools, continuing to fund apprenticeship programs and other non-traditional pathways into the workforce is absolutely vital and should be a priority of the Congress. This past year, I led 31 of my colleagues in a letter requesting $64 million for CTE programs specifically at the high school level for this purpose. But of course, we build more than just submarines in Rhode Island, and it requires more than just submarines to maintain, as Vice President Harris said, the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world. We've seen in Ukraine recently that unmanned systems in the air and in the water are a big part of what the future of warfare and the future of our defense will look like. This is really extraordinary. Without a significant navy of its own, Ukraine has been able to destroy the bulk of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea and reopen the shipping lanes that are a lifeline for its economy and for the war effort. It has done so primarily through the use of drones and other unmanned systems. That is a telling example that any nation that wants to maintain its military advantage must get smart about the use of unmanned systems. Luckily for us, here in Rhode Island, we remain a hub both for the development of unmanned systems and also for the wargaming necessary to ensure that the United States is well positioned to be a leader in this new era of unmanned warfare. I have requested significant funding for, among other things, the partnership between the University of Rhode Island and the University of Connecticut to deliver on research and workforce for unmanned systems specifically. And will continue to work with my colleagues to support more funding, particularly for R&D in this space, which is much needed. Finally, as a member of the Homeland Security Committee and a successor to Jim Langevin, who was a longtime attendee of this event, I'm his successor both representing District 2 in Congress, and I'm also his successor on the Homeland Security Committee. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't highlight the importance of maintaining strength in the cyber domain. Because more than anywhere else, this is where our adversaries have been most aggressive in directly attacking the United States. So in all of these other modes, our adversaries, they try to project their strength, they try to project their aggression, they put up a strong face, but they are usually careful not to cross the line. When it comes to cyber warfare, that line has been crossed for a long time. I mean, our adversaries actively, today and for years now, have been spreading misinformation designed to undermine Americans' confidence in our democracy and our institutions. They have been hacking into critical infrastructure, government agencies, and private companies. They've been developing artificial intelligence and quantum computing capabilities to rival ours. So on the Homeland Security Committee, I'm working to shore up our nation's defense to cyber attacks. This is a bipartisan effort and one that we need to take seriously as a country. I recently introduced a bipartisan bill with Representative Crenshaw from Texas. He and I have partnered on it. It's a bipartisan bill called the Contingency Plan for Critical Infrastructure Act. This bill would help secure our nation's critical infrastructure, including the electric grids, water systems, public transit, energy pipelines, and other critical infrastructure against cyber attacks by taking the very obvious but unmet steps up until now of cataloging our critical infrastructure and the cyber preparedness of each individual piece of infrastructure to make sure that we know where our gaps are and we're investing in filling them. I also co-sponsored the Cybersecurity Skills Integration Act to help fund more educational opportunities and workforce development pipelines for cyber in particular. We have tens of thousands of unfilled cybersecurity jobs in the United States right now. There is a demand for these jobs. There is a supply of people who want these jobs. We need to provide that link of the education and the workforce development to connect the job seekers with the job opportunities in the cyberspace. These are just three priorities that I wanted to highlight today. There's obviously much more that we can talk about, and as I look around the room, I see a range of different stakeholders here who are working on different facets of strengthening our nation's security, but in particular, supporting our submarine programs, supporting our development of unmanned capabilities, beefing up our cybersecurity. Those are three priorities of mine as I represent our district in Congress and our state. As we approach the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, we are reminded that American democracy is still, after 250 years, a beacon that billions of people around the world look to for inspiration. And our American experiment is only possible because of the deterrent that our armed forces, including our Navy and our Coast Guard, pose to our adversaries. Teddy Roosevelt said that a good Navy is not a provocation to war, it is the surest guarantee of peace. And that is as true today as when he launched the Great White Fleet over 100 years ago. We invest in our defense sector not because we want war, but because we want peace. And I want to thank each of you for the role that you are playing in protecting our country, in maintaining peace, and ensuring that our democratic system will continue to be the envy of the world for generations and centuries yet to come. So thank you all very much for being a part of this. Thank you for including me here today. My job is to support you in the work that you're doing, and I'm absolutely committed to doing everything that I can to help you out. So thank you all very much.